Chapter 56. On returning to the cottage, the inspector knocked 3 times, and Aldous answered almost immediately. "Hello, did that help any?" the vicar asked as soon as he was over the threshold. "Some, thank you," the inspector replied, removing his coat and hat. "Would you care to join me for a cup of tea?" Aldous asked hopefully. "I have just made a pot." He led him through to the kitchen where a fresh pot stood steaming. "I would very much appreciate the tea, but I must get on with writing my report of the events on Wednesday night and Monday morning. Or rather, the events that I can recall." Aldous poured a cup of steaming brown liquid and passed it to him. "Have you remembered anything before this morning yet? Do you remember appearing at my door?" The inspector nodded. "I think the walk may have dislodged a few memories, yes. There is a rather large gap in my memory, which I am hoping will come back to me. I tend to find that as I mentally retrace my steps, my memory opens up on scenes I thought I had forgotten." The inspector took a swig of tea. "Well, I wish you luck," Aldous informed him. "Thank you, Father. For now, I shall be upstairs. See you later." He picked up the pen and paper from the table. "Indeed, Inspector, I shall be down here pottering around should you need anything." "Thank you, most kind." The inspector took his leave and ascended the stairs. Once in his room, he sat on the bed, back against the headboard. The bed was old, soft, and very comfortable. He took a deep breath and began to write. Date: Tuesday the 4th of November, 1969. I woke yesterday, Monday the 3rd of November, 1969, at the vicarage in Firestone Copse, where I am still currently resident. I was awake for about an hour in the afternoon, during which I ate and drank. I then fell back into unconsciousness. I do not recall this incident. I was told of it by the sole resident of the vicarage, Aldous Squires. I remained unconscious until this morning, when the full situation became evident to me. Upon waking this morning, I had no memory of where I was, or how I had gotten here. I did not know who I was, and could barely fathom anything. Aldous kindly fed me again, and slowly things have begun to come back to me. My last memory, before waking this morning, is leaving the Green Man late on the night of Wednesday the 5th. I believe the hour was sometime around 1 a.m. I recall being outside, and of being at the Firestone. There was no moon. I had the enhancer with me, and once activated, the stone took on a glow in the dark. I recall speaking to some locals, who told me stories of the stone, where it was seen to be glowing. It is not difficult to see how these legends may have begun. As I write, more memories are coming to me. I remember now, I had the field enhancer set to full, and the glow of the stones was significantly enhanced. I now remember having the overwhelming need to touch it, to feel the stone, to experience the power that seemed to be emanating through it. On touching the rock, all my senses were lost, as if I was suddenly plunged into water. "Yes," he exclaimed out loud, closing his eyes as the memory suddenly flooded back. He tried to concentrate and began furiously scribbling. All around me, all I could hear was the most incredible rushing noise, deafening beyond sound. It was beyond loud, as though 1,000 people were screaming at me all at once. The noise was unbearable, from all around, yet with no definite source. I felt a pressure all about my body, as though I was being crushed from all directions. My eyes were closed in defence, and I daren't open them. They remained locked shut. I had no feeling of gravity, no sense of up or down. I could barely tell what my own shape was anymore. I tried to move my arms, then my legs, but felt no sensation of any movement at all. I could no longer feel my body, yet the pain was incredible. The longer it went on, the greater the pressure against my body. I finally braved opening my eyes to attempt to make sure I was still in one piece, and tried to ascertain some idea as to where I was and what was going on. Upon opening them, I saw I was surrounded by swirling, flashing lights. They were dizzying, as if on a merry-go-round. The view did not change, no matter what direction I looked in. It took every ounce of energy I could manifest to concentrate on what was happening around me. I felt that if my focus lapsed for a second, I would be ripped apart by the sheer force of the environment I had appeared in. For a moment, through the dizzying view that surrounded me, I caught a glimpse of trees and a starry sky above. It flashed across my vision, like a series of photographs splayed out in front of me, skimming quickly past, each picture slightly different as the trees fought the wind. They faded in and out as the indeterminable surroundings encircled me. I could not tell how long I was there. It felt like it never ended, but now I looked back, it seemed to be over in a moment. Despite these differing perceptions, by my estimations it lasted 5 to 7 days. I was sure that I would die at any moment. The pain was perpetual and agonizing. As the light swelled, the pictured trees reappeared in front of me again, scattered in an infinitely long line stretching beyond my comprehension. They were bigger this time, and closer. Each image was slightly different. Each was a moment captured in still frame which span past me, only to be replaced by another and another. As they were the only thing I could perceive in this nightmarish place, I gathered every atom of energy I could muster and headed for them. I seemed to make headway through the ghastly din, and as I approached, the images raced around me faster. Their dizzying race span about me until the many images moved so quickly they merged, becoming one constant animated vision, and I fell into it. He stopped, gathering his thoughts. It is here that my memory fails. I cannot penetrate what happened between then and this morning. I remembered the corpse Drew had found and the circumstances of its arrival in Firestone. What I can now start to piece together is that whatever it was that caused the body in the copse to appear here, I believe I may have experienced too. My theory is that whatever it was that caused the body in the copse to appear here, I believe I may have experienced it too. I wonder if perhaps the appearance of the body saved me, returning me to the copse, or if in some way my actions triggered its appearance. We were both victims of the energy the copse attracts. I presume my success at interacting with the energy came from some protection I gained from the enhancer. I have this to thank for my survival. He thought for a moment. My presumption is that there must be a correlation between the distance that a person is away from the Firestone and the length of time you spend going through the... He paused, trying to think of what he should call the environment he had experienced that had brought him here. Vortex, singularity, wormhole, I know not what it was. I can only retell my experience for the official record, and hope that any evidence I can find be used to help determine what it was. I put my survival down to a short trip, as I was so close, and the protection that I must have had from the being inside the field enhancer. What caused the man from Swindon Drew found, all those we discovered in Bill's mansion, to have appeared here, I know not. He considered the readings he had taken around the town. One possibility, I realise, is that there could be a build-up of electromagnetic energy around the town, centred on the Firestone. I have been registering high readings of pressure, of electromagnetic energy, and I believe that these are due to the unknown energy that lit the Firestone and delivered me here. This build-up of energy could occasionally be released, like two opposing sides of a fault line slipping against each other, causing a quake of energy to escape out like a wave. Judging by my experience, this wave could travel four-dimensionally, through space and time. Anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the wake of energy would be pulled from their place and time and dragged here to its epicentre. My theory is that this would have caused the wounds we have seen on the bodies, the strange holes in their chest being a consequence of the energy finding them and moving them into the... He stopped again, searching for words to describe things hitherto unseen to human eyes. His head ached a little, and his wrist was strained from the constant scribble he dashed across the paper. I am only thankful that the field enhancer saved me from such a fate. I will of course have to confer to my readings, but of what I can remember of them, there may be some credence to this idea. I hope I can now piece together some explanation from the new clues I have in order to calculate why the energy is building up and find a way to stop it. He closed his eyes and rubbed his pupils through the eyelids. He began to read back through what he had written and tried to focus on what had happened to see if he could recall anything new. As he read, he played everything in his mind over and over until his head began to hurt. Eventually, he was unable to keep his eyes open, and the pure escape of sleep finally claimed him. Wednesday the 5th of November 1969. Chapter 57. The inspector suddenly sat upright in bed. The morning had crept up on him. The previous evening had slipped away. Sleep had, at some point, taken him, but he couldn't recall when, so waking surprised him. He allowed himself to wake slowly. Spread about him on the bed were the crumpled sheets of paper that he had been writing on last night, and in the dim light of the morning he collected them up and read back through what he had written. The hurried scrawl made him question if what he had remembered had happened at all, or if his mind was trying to fill the gap in his memory, and this was the best it could do. As he read, he remembered falling through the stream of pictures, but anything after that still eluded him. He knew that in a sudden rush of air he had left the pain and spinning behind, but what happened next was still a mystery. He recalled appearing somewhere utterly opposite to the nightmare he had left behind, but equally as confusing. He stared out of the window as a grey sky was slowly and painfully illuminated. He could see the tops of the trees from where he sat, and as he watched them swaying hypnotically in the wind, a memory was opening and he began scribbling furiously again. On entering the picture, the spinning ceased, though my head still span and I ached. There was still a pressure bearing on me, but it was static. I now could not move. My limbs were stiff, as though seized up, but I could feel my body again. I could also no longer breathe. I struggled, and found that I could gain some give against the resistance, and with every effort I gained a little more advantage. I could also now tell that I was facing upwards. The feeling of gravity had returned. I began forcing myself up, and it was as if swimming in thick, almost solid liquid. It did not take a lot of effort, thankfully, for my head to break the surface. When it did, I rested, took deep, thankful breaths, and then began the struggle to release the rest of my body from this strange prison. Wherever I had appeared was as dark as can be imagined. The inspector paused for a moment, the remembrance of the struggle making him realise why his body still ached today. It had taken every inch of his strength to force his way out of his entrapment, and his muscles ached from the effort. Once free, all I can recall is running as best as I could, though I do not know from what, from where, or in which direction. I simply followed my instinct blindly through the dark. The journey didn't seem to lead anywhere. The train was completely black, and I simply stumbled on. Obstacles unseen blocked every turn I took, and I began to wonder if I had completely escaped from the strange place I had entered on touching the Firestone, or perhaps I had escaped from one place and now found myself trapped in another. On I raced. My limbs ached, my head swam, and I felt as though it might implode with pain at any moment. I do not remember finding Aldous' cottage. I do not remember him bringing me in. Therefore, the logical thing to do would be to attempt to discover where I was taken when I touched the Firestone, and what happened between there and here. So today I shall enter the copse to retrace my steps, and track my path through the copse to discover the start of the trail. The inspector paused for a second to rest. He allowed his mind to relax. When he was ready, he continued writing, as much to satisfy his own mind of the events than to record them. Yesterday morning I woke, emancipated, with approximately 7 days' growth on my cheeks. I discovered that it was Tuesday, and when my memory returned I realised it should have been Thursday. Although the experience between touching the rock and falling through the picture only seemed to last a few moments, and despite having reappeared 3 days before I left, I appeared to have aged by several days, perhaps even a week. Certainly I was malnourished enough to support this hypothesis, though I may never know. My watch is broken. It has not just stopped, but it has been rendered completely useless by the experience. I believe that the falling through the vision of the tree swaying in the wind against the starry sky was me returning from wherever it was that the touching of the stone took me. I have now only 1 day left before the event of my disappearance reoccurs. During this time I will have to remain unseen. I will return to the Green Man tonight and follow myself to the Firestone so I can pick up exactly where I left off, so to speak. Perhaps I may find some clue as to what happened if I witness myself vanishing. I can then collect the field enhancer, my bag, and continue my investigation. The inspector carefully placed the papers of the report together and folded one corner. He then lifted a rug that covered the wooden floor and slipped the paper into the gap between the two floorboards, anchoring it with the folded corner to stop it from falling through completely. This, he hoped, would keep it safe from prying eyes. He doubted whether Aldous would believe it, but as security for the next few days would be an issue, this was the best he could do. Teasing the memories for his tired brain had taken its toll, and his body still ached from the experience. His mind was weary with the effort of trying to recall the events, so he decided to allow his mind the opportunity to rest, settled back down into bed, and allowed slumber to once again take over his tired body. Chapter 58. He woke again a few hours later with the grey sky framed through the small window. The clock on the bedside table read 10:30. With an extended sleep he felt suitably refreshed, and was starting to feel like he was recovering from his ordeal. He thought about what his original movements had been today, the discovery of the old manor house. His travels had not brought him this far north in the town, and he was, he hoped, without risk of being seen whilst he entered the copse and tried to retrace his steps in an attempt to discover where exactly he had appeared. He went to the bathroom, washed and brushed his teeth with a squirt of paste on his finger. He studied the hair covering his cheeks, deciding against a shave, as keeping it might decrease the chances of being recognised. He then descended the stairs to see Aldous, who was quietly reading a Maigret in the front room. The fire he had woken in front of on Monday was lazily licking at the remains of a log. A cat had appeared, and was curled up comfortably in front of it. The cat and Aldous both looked up as he entered the room. The cat returned to its slumber indifferently. Aldous stood up excitedly. "Ah, good morning, Inspector. Can I get you anything? Perhaps you would like some breakfast." "Having missed dinner due to my exhaustion, I am once again extremely hungry, and a hearty meal would be most appreciated, Aldous, thank you." "Of course." He thought for a moment, thinking through the contents of his cupboard. "Will eggs and bacon be all right again?" "That would be most appreciated, thank you, yes." Aldous stood and made his way into the kitchen, the inspector following him. "So, may I ask what your plans are?" Aldous asked as he began preparing the food. The air quickly filled with the sound and smell of frying bacon. "Of course, I must make the most of this extra time that's been afforded of me to try and discover where I appeared and why. After eating I will go out again and attempt to see if I left any kind of trail." "Have you somehow been travelling through time?" Aldous blurted out. The inspector had presumed the matter had been expressing on his mind. Aldous had recovered a little from the experience of having a strange man appear on his doorstep, and was growing accustomed to the inspector's company. He felt more confident in asking some of the questions that had been raised in his mind. "You understand that any conversations we have over the matter must remain completely confidential. Tomorrow afternoon I will return to see you, and you will need to sign a document to show that you agree with the conditions I told you about. I'm sure I needn't explain that such occurrences as this have massive implications for national security." "Of course, as you mentioned earlier, I should not discuss this with anyone, and I fully intend not to. Do I take it, then, that you travelled back to Sunday night from Wednesday?" Aldous dished up the eggs and bacon, placing a full plate in front of the inspector. "Thank you." The inspector began gratefully tucking in, and spoke through a mouth full of food. "Well, as far as I can see, there does not seem to be any other explanation currently presenting itself. Thus I intend to retrace my steps back from the front door to where I appeared in the early hours of Monday morning. I've deduced that it must have been summer in the copse. The weather has been wet since I arrived, and judging from the state of my clothes and shoes, I must have left quite a trail through the trees and mud. If it would be agreeable to you, I would like to borrow some Wellingtons, a torch, and if possible a camera." Aldous blushed a little. "Well, actually, I already checked, and you were 2 sizes too big to fit into my Wellingtons." "Ah!" The inspector paused in his eating to consider for a moment. He wanted to curse the air at this stroke of bad luck, but held his tongue. "So I rummaged through some more of the leftover jumble I had in the church, and I found a few pairs and a few odd ones that might fit you." Aldous leant on the table to help himself out of his seat, and pottered off to the hall. He returned with a bulky black sack, fit to burst with boots. "My, I had no idea the church was so keen on Wellingtons," the inspector quipped with a raised eyebrow. "The result of old age getting the better of me, I'm afraid. Too many jobs to do, and I haven't the speed or the strength to do them all." He placed the bag on the kitchen floor. "Luckily for you," he joked back with a whispery laugh. The inspector rooted about in the bag, and after a few tries he managed to find a boot to fit each foot, a red boot for the right foot, and a blue boot for the left. "Not a perfect match," the inspector admitted. "Not that it matters, as we will be the only people to see them," Aldous pointed out. "Yes, let's hope so," the inspector agreed. "Now, a torch and a camera. Let's see." Aldous hurried off thoughtfully, while the inspector removed the boots and continued to scoff his cooling breakfast. After a few moments, Aldous returned with an armful of things. He placed them all down carefully on the kitchen counter, then changed the batteries in the small torch. "I'm afraid the torch isn't very powerful, but it should do the job." He switched it on and off to check it worked. The inspector chewed. Aldous rifled through a drawer and produced a spare roll of film. "The camera is a bit old, but it was quite advanced in its day." Passed them both to the inspector, who admired the camera. It had an adjustable shutter speed to allow more light into the lens for longer exposures. It also had different settings should the environment be dark, light, or the subject moving. "Indeed, a very nice piece of equipment," he agreed. "Yes, I used to quite enjoy photography in my younger days. Haven't used it for an age, though. There's still half a roll in there you can use up. I'm afraid I only have one spare, but I can pick some more up for you if you wish." "I'm not sure if that would be necessary. I would hate to put you to any more trouble. I'm sure what we have here will suffice," the inspector informed him gratefully. Aldous placed the camera on the table and stood looking at the inspector as he ate. "Is everything all right, Aldous?" the inspector asked, suddenly feeling rather self-conscious. "Yes. Well, I can't explain it. I've been feeling as if your arrival in Firestone has lifted a weight from my shoulders." He looked out of the window thoughtfully. "I've always felt that there was something about this town that didn't fit quite right. Part of the reason I've stayed so long, I suppose. I felt as though I was needed here, to try and protect the town." He shook his head and smiled. He wasn't sure what he was saying made any sense. "Whatever it is, it's beginning to lift. Can you feel it? Can you feel the town suppressing something, holding something back?" The inspector shook his head. "No," he said simply. "There is no doubt something about the town that does not quite fit. My presence here testifies to that. Perhaps if I were here a little longer I would feel this oppression that you, and others I seem to recall, experience. But I am a man of reason and logic. My role as an inspector depends on it. I have no doubt that places, areas, can take on an atmosphere, but this atmosphere is, in my experience, in the eye of the beholder. It stems from their perception of the place they are in. For example, during the day your cottage is no doubt a delightful, picturesque little building. However, I am sure that during a dark, stormy night it could take on a completely different feeling. It could seem menacing, haunting, full of mystery. We are raised listening to ghost stories where these traits are associated with these emotions. In reality, the cottage and its surroundings are indifferent to what they look like or what time of day it is." "Yes, I see what you're saying, but Firestone is different. There's something dark here, something that seems to be lifting since you arrived." "Well, my presence here is evident that there is certainly something about this area that differs from the norm. I'm sure there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for it, even if it is one that we have not come across before." Aldous smiled at his words. "Of course, there you go again, trying to fathom God's magnificent plan," he commented wryly. The inspector remembered the hospitality that Aldous had offered, and did not want to offend his opinions. He decided to skirt around the subject. "Well, I certainly hope I can be of help in whatever way possible." He stood and put his new boots and coat on. The pockets of his sheepskin were generous, and he placed the camera in one and the torch in the other. "I think perhaps I should make a move. The breakfast was excellent, thank you." "You're very welcome. I shall be doing stew for dinner. There will be sandwiches for lunch. I'll leave the bread and ham out for you. I have a few errands to run today, so I may not be here when you return, but I was hoping we could have dinner together before you leave." "I am most grateful. I don't know how long I will be, but dinner sounds wonderful." "Good. I will leave the back door open for you in case I'm not here. Let me show you." The back door to Aldous' cottage was further down the main corridor, beyond the kitchen and the living room. Aldous unlocked it and showed the inspector out into a ferociously cold morning with a biting wind that showed no mercy. "I admit I don't envy you in the slightest, Inspector, traipsing through the muddy copse in this weather," Aldous told him from the warmth of the threshold. "But I do wish you luck." "Thank you, Aldous. See you for dinner this evening." Agreed. Stay safe and see you later. And with that, the inspector turned and headed out into the cold day. Chapter 59. Aldous gratefully closed his back door, leaving the inspector alone with the cold. He made a cursory check for tracks, or any kind of trail. The only prints he could see belonged to Aldous and his cat. He made his way around to the front of the building, eyes down, searching for anything he might recognise as his own. On the paving at the front of the building, he recognised the vicar's prints coming and going over the last couple of days. Although the rain had made a good attempt at cleaning them away, there was still a faint trace of his own footprints leading to the front door. By the angle of the step and the sliding clumsy print, he could tell that they had been made in a state of beleaguered confusion. They led away from the cottage, and he followed them across the lawn toward the gravestones as the canopy began to bruise and darker grey clouds rolled over the sky. Following the trail was an odd experience for the inspector. He had no memory of making it, of ever being there. It was as if he were retracing someone else's tracks, not his own. The trail through the gravestones was haphazard. He had obviously fallen blindly through them, tripping often. The grass was disturbed, the muddy prints led this way and that. He had not travelled in a straight line, but wandered across and between the stones, with no fixed direction or destination. The inspector wondered again at the miracle of arriving at Aldous' door, and what might have become of him had he simply collapsed between the trees. He followed the tracks and approached the woods, the trunks so close together and so overrun with brambles and nettles that he could hardly believe he had come from them. The trail was lost for a while as the inspector carefully searched for a clue as to where he had appeared from the trees and come to the graveyard. He eventually found it when he spotted a path had been forced through the undergrowth. Nettles lay battered and bent, branches snapped. He slipped through the path in between the trunks, and once again the copse surrounded him. He fought his way through the brambles and nettles that protected the line of trees, tripping on young saplings that were sprouting as the copse continued to expand its territory. Stepping into it was like stepping into a different world. Here the wind behaved differently as it whistled between the trunks. Sound echoed and bounced about the trees, the diverted path delaying its course, distracting its source. The canopy, despite being bare, still offered a protection from the dim light of the sun, so it surrounded him with an eerie darkness that felt all-encompassing. Bare branches shattered the sky into a million fractured pieces. The dank and damp filled his nostrils with the smell of decay and death as the leaves of 1,000 autumns slowly rotted underfoot. He turned his attention to the leaves and quickly spotted, in the thick layer of decay beneath his feet, a path of clumsy footprints staggering through the trees. The trail led directly away from the graveyard, but as he followed it he found more gravestones in the trees. The copse had spread, showing no respect for the sacred ground, slowly taking over the graveyard. As he followed the trail through the trees, he saw a space where the tree's grasp hadn't taken control. Their growth skirted around a dark structure trying to hide in the trees. He was unable to make out its full shape, and he had to resist investigating what it might be and continued to follow his path. He saw scuffs in the leaves where he had fallen or bounced off of trees, and generally the trail was one of a hurried step. Despite himself, the inspector crept along, as if trying not to disturb some hidden occupant of this strange world he had entered. The gravestones continued to appear. In some cases just their peak broke through the fallen leaves. At the gravestone's limit he found a low stone wall that skirted about the graveyard, a protective barrier that the trees had ignored. He skirted along it, finding some freshly disturbed bricks, which he took as being the place he had climbed or fallen over it. Once over, the trail continued into the copse between the dark trees. He followed it in. Occasionally he would hear a branch snapping, or a disturbance in the leaves, though from what distance and from what direction it was hard to tell. He put the noises down to the wild residents creeping through the trees, though he saw no other trails crossing his own, as if no life wanted to be here. He pressed on, surprising himself when he suddenly found he had left the copse and had appeared out on a road. As he had headed north, he determined that he must be on the same road as the church, the road where he had witnessed the man's strange behaviour in the trees the day before. He wondered where he should head next, and after a few minutes' search he decided to follow a vague track he found that crossed the road. A few cars passed without seeming to pay him any mind, while he traipsed along the border between the road and the trees on the opposite side, looking for a disturbance where he might have emerged from the copse. After a few minutes' cautious searching, he came across a wide gap in the brambles where something large had forced its way out onto the road recently. As this was the best lead he had found, he decided to pursue the trail and force his way back into the copse. This was a much older collection of trees. The trunks were larger, and were thankfully further apart, making the going easier. His trail continued, falling and tripping around clumps of ancient and twisted bark. The path was harder to see in places, and the inspector had difficulty following it, but continued on, following the clumsy trail. After an hour tracing his way down false starts and dead ends, he finally found what he had been looking for. He was concentrating so intensely on the trail and the leaves that he hardly noticed when the trees parted, and he found himself in an opening, standing in front of a huge mound of dark, sticky brown mud. It towered above him. He guessed it stood 35 feet at its highest. The sides were steep and slippery, scarred with landslides. He stomped around it. The trees had not managed to grow on it, but grew right up to its edge. He measured it in steps, taking photographs of it on the way round. He estimated the circumference as being about 150 yards. He carefully studied its sides, and at one point found a trail heading up to the top. He studied it closer, and realized that it was actually someone's quick descent which had caused the disturbance in the mud. With a slight shock, he recognized the footprint as being his own, and it was from the top that the trail started. He could find no footsteps leading up, only the clumsy fall down. Carefully, and with a few falls, he began to climb up the steep side. On reaching the top, he was afforded a completely different view of the copse. From here, he could just see over the tops of the surrounding branches. Finding this view from the mound enlightened him as to the mound's success of being undiscovered for so long. Its only peaks slightly edged over the tallest branches that surrounded it. Its position, hidden deep in a forgotten corner of the copse, meant it was not viewable from anywhere other than when you were stood up close to it. He took a few photographs of the view before continuing his search. It did not take long to discover the scene of a struggle. The ground on top of the mound was mostly flattened by the wind and the rain, but in the centre the mud was disturbed as if something had recently appeared from within. This, the inspector realised, was where he had appeared the previous night. He now realised what had caused the sensation of being trapped that he had experienced when he had fallen into the picture of the trees. It was of being buried, and the pressure of the mud pressing against his torso. He used this elevated view from the summit and began to try and calculate his position. He could see the steeple of the church, and it was closer than he expected it to be. The twisting path through the trees he had followed had caused the journey to seem longer, but he was sure he would not have found the place at all if he hadn't followed the trail. He took a best guess at how far he had travelled from the church and at his proximity to the road he had crossed. He guessed that it would be quicker to head directly back to the road and make his way back to the church along the easier path it would give him, so he decided to head in that direction. He carefully descended and began searching through the trees for an easy trail, slowly stumbling his way through the trunks towards the road. Eventually he found his way out, and snapped a few branches around his exit from the trees as a marker for later. Then began the trek down the road to Aldous' house. As he walked, he was cautious of any oncoming cars, turning his face away from them to prevent being inadvertently recognised. It was whilst performing this manoeuvre that he noticed, hidden amongst the trees on the same side of the road as the church, a squad car. Intrigued, he cautiously retraced his steps up the road, finding an entrance into the trees, but only because of a few broken twigs at the sides where something big had been forced through it recently. There was a thin parting of mud through the trees, similar to that Drew had found. Down this, fresh tracks and battered grass had been created. By his calculations, within the last half hour, he stalked cautiously along the path, and up ahead he saw the squad car. From what he could tell, there was no one sat in any of the seats, but someone could of course be laying down or be in the boot. He continued to approach with the utmost of caution. When he reached the car, he glanced in and found it empty. Just beyond it, he noticed a thinner path, just wide enough for a person to fit through. Whatever the owner of the car was doing in the trees, it appeared he was doing it down there. The inspector slowly made his way along it, keeping low to try and avoid being seen. He eventually came to an opening, a rare patch where no trees grew. Stood in the centre of this patch was Sergeant Banks. He stood stock still, looking out at the tall branches around him, listening intently, just as the man had been the day before and as the others had been in the garden of the Black Prince. The inspector quietly found himself an inconspicuous spot and settled down to see what the elusive sergeant would do. As his watch had stopped on Wednesday night, the inspector could not know the exact time, but after what he had judged to be approximately half an hour, Banks suddenly turned and marched back down the path. He had not moved, save for the occasional sway in the wind in all that time, but had simply stood, staring. The inspector watched him traipse ignorantly past where he crouched in the undergrowth, and waited until his footsteps had disappeared out of earshot before removing himself from his hiding place and walking carefully back down the path. He heard Banks reverse his car back out onto the road again and drive away. By the time he emerged from the trees, he had gone. He then began walking back towards the town, towards the church, still no closer to being able to fathom what Banks or the man he had seen yesterday had been doing in the trees. The afternoon wore on in a flurry of cold wind, and the inspector hurried his pace along the road. He finally returned to Aldous' house, entering through the unlocked back door and removing his boots before making his way into the kitchen. Aldous appeared from the living room, where the inspector had correctly deduced he would be reading with his feline friend. "So what happened?" he asked excitedly. The inspector couldn't hold back a smile at Aldous' enthusiasm. I believe I've discovered where in the copse I appeared, though how I got there requires further investigation. Where? Aldous asked, breathless with excitement. I discovered a hidden mound. I appeared in it, the inspector replied, sitting down on the sofa to rest. A mound? Aldous tried to fathom the situation. How big must it have been for you to appear in it? Where is it? Aldous asked, unable to stop himself firing questions. Approximately 35 feet high. It's huge, the inspector answered. As to its location, that might be better answered with a map. Did you say 35 feet high? How can something that big go unnoticed? Aldous asked, confused. Perhaps by understanding its location we can begin to piece together the answer to that. Hold on a moment. The inspector bounded upstairs, surprising Aldous with his agility. He returned shortly with his pen and paper and quickly drew a map of the area surrounding the vicarage. It is hidden deep in the copse here. The inspector indicated the section of copse on his hastily drawn map where he had discovered the mound. It is too far back from the road to be seen through or over the trees. It has become a forgotten corner, untouched for a long time. My goodness, you're good at this inspecting, aren't you? Aldous half asked, half told the inspector. He was suddenly very impressed with the time-travelling stranger that had happened upon his house. I also discovered that your graveyard is a lot bigger than I realised. It goes back at least another 10 yards, and there appears to be a hidden tomb in the trees. The inspector continued casually, as if he hadn't noticed what Aldous had said. Aldous' eyes widened in shock. Really? Oh my! He covered his gaping mouth for a moment, then leapt out of his seat and began pulling on his own Wellingtons. The inspector watched for a moment, then stood and walked to the back door to put his own boots and coat back on. When both men were prepared in hats and coats, Aldous turned to face the inspector. Could you show me? He asked. Of course, the inspector replied. Follow me. Aldous followed him out the back door and they walked to the bottom of the cemetery, where Aldous peered through the gloom between the trunks. I can see gravestones in there, he admitted. I can't see any tombs, though. It is much further back. Do you think we can walk through the trees? I'll certainly try, he replied, and with the inspector leading the way, they entered the trees. They carefully made for the closest stone to them. It was dirty and had almost been pushed completely over by the roots. The inspector scraped the moss away with his boot to reveal the barely visible engraving. Doreen Clark, the inspector read the name. Devoted wife, mother and grandmother, died in her sleep. 8th of December 1890 to 7th of April 1957. The inspector glanced back at the edge of the trees and calculated a distance. So the trees have encroached at least 6 yards in, say, the last 12 years, he estimated. Aldous nodded, seeing his logic. Left unchecked, they have been slowly encroaching upon your graveyard, he considered for a moment, and indeed the whole town. Let's press on. They climbed carefully over fallen branches and trudged through deep leaves, and after a little effort chose another tombstone deep in the trees to study. The inspector peeled back years of moss to get a better look at the inscription. William Beaufont, the inspector read from the lichen-covered stone, dearly missed, 12th September 1794 to the 15th of March 1844. I had no idea these gravestones existed, Aldous admitted. It is amazing how quickly they have become hidden. Not to worry. I think there lies something of even greater interest further in. Do you think you can make it a bit further? I'll certainly try, he replied, and they traipsed onwards into the woods, the inspector having to help him here and there where the going was tough. They passed a few more tombstones without paying too much attention, and eventually they found what they were looking for. It was an ancient tomb, as the inspector had thought. It was still standing despite nature's attempts at pulling it down. It was covered in vines, its walls were cracked and moss-covered. Its door stood at an angle, as if pushed open from within. All in all, it presented a rather ominous shape protruding from the trees, but this did not stop the men from approaching it. Well, how fascinating, Aldous commented enthusiastically. He made his way over to the building, which stood in a small, bare clearing. It appears this old cemetery has a lot of secrets. They made their way around it, trying to find a name or dates. When they could find no trace, the inspector began removing some of the ivy that had attached itself to the stone above the door. Eventually he found a name. Brockenhurst was engraved in deep, foreboding letters. Brockenhurst, the inspector murmured, trying to place a name. Oh, of course, Bill, he realised suddenly. You recognise the name? Aldous asked. Yes, Bill, up at the manor. His family were Brockenhurst in the 16th century. Well, it appears we may have stumbled upon some of his family history then, Aldous said, leaning wearily against a nearby tree. The inspector noticed his host's condition. Shall we head back? He asked him. I think the weather is starting to turn. Certainly there can't be much daylight left. Yes, if you think so, Aldous replied, the sound of relief showing in his voice. Then trudged back to the cottage, where Aldous collapsed in his chair and was soon dozing. The inspector allowed him to sleep while he wrote up his report of his day's findings. He then woke Aldous with a fresh cup of tea. The old man stirred gently awake at the inspector's gentle shake. I'm sorry, Inspector. It must have been the long day catching up on me. The old man apologised as he rubbed his eyes. I think that stew must be ready by now. I'm just about ready for some food. Thank you for the tea. He took a grateful mouthful. You're welcome, the inspector replied, sipping his own cup. What time will you be leaving tonight? Aldous asked. Now, I need to be at the Green Man for about 1 a.m, so I'll give myself plenty of time and aim to leave here at about 12. I see, he sipped his tea. And will I see you again? Of course. I shall be back tomorrow with some papers for you to sign. Ah, good. Well then, shall we eat? They made their way into the kitchen, where they ate heartily. They then sat in the lounge and chatted. Aldous managed to keep himself awake until 11 o'clock, when he admitted defeat. Well, I really must be off to bed, he said through a long yawn. Good luck tonight, and I will see you tomorrow. Yes, good night, and thank you again for your hospitality. I'll reimburse you for your trouble in the morning. There's really no need. You are welcome. It's the most excitement I've seen in... He had to think for a moment. Actually, it's the most excitement I've ever seen. Thank you. Aldous was genuinely grateful. You're welcome. Good night. Good night, Inspector. Aldous took his leave and slowly and carefully took his tired body upstairs. The inspector listened to him preparing for bed and waited. When he was sure that Aldous was quite asleep, he took a pair of scissors from a kitchen drawer and made his way upstairs to the bathroom, where he removed the beard that had covered his face and trimmed back his moustache. He then changed back into his own clothes that Aldous, good to his word, had freshly cleaned. When he was finished, he double-checked his appearance in the bathroom mirror and was satisfied that he was back to looking as he normally did. He walked downstairs, put his shoes back on, and then headed out of the door and towards the Firestone. Chapter 60. The chill of the night pushed him along, wanting him to hurry, to get tonight over with so he could return to some form of normality. As he approached the Green Man, he slowed, suddenly recalling that he had heard footsteps following him on his way to the stone. He wondered if it had been his own that he had heard, the footsteps he was about to make as he followed himself, or if someone else had been out in the night. He ducked low behind a parked van and waited for his earlier self to come out into the night. He glanced around the scene, trying to peer into the darkest corner, looking for the slightest movement, but saw nothing. Suddenly, the front door opened and the inspector caught sight of himself for the first time. As he watched, a twinge of nausea filled him at looking at himself. The experience was quite odd. His earlier self checked each dark corner and hiding place, as he had just done, before walking away towards the stone. He held back for a moment before following, to see if anyone should appear, and noticed Banks emerging from the shadows. He waited a moment longer, then set off, following Banks. Banks' usually heavy gait was gone. Now he walked quickly with agility. He slipped in between the darkness, occasionally disappearing completely and causing the inspector to wonder if he had lost him. Eventually they reached the Firestone, and he watched as Banks settled down behind a car to watch his earlier self busy around the Firestone. To his horror, the inspector watched as Banks produced a gun from inside his coat. The inspector quietly knelt down behind a tree on the edge of the copse and picked up a large, sturdy branch, and quickly snuck up to Banks, who watched mesmerised as the inspector stepped inside the field enhancer's metal poles, and the stone began to glow. He held out his gun and took aim just as the inspector reached out and touched the stone, and vanished. Banks stepped out from his hiding place, dumbfounded, looking at the stone in disbelief. Suddenly, from behind him, he heard, "Banks!" in a raised voice. He spun round to find himself face to face with the inspector. "Inspector!" he cried in shock. The inspector simply nodded in greeting, then hit him across the head as hard as he could with the heavy stick, knocking him unconscious. He lay on the floor, unharmed but quite asleep. The inspector bent over him and searched his pockets. He removed his keys and wallet, and retrieved the gun from the floor where it had fallen. He immediately removed the bullets and placed them and the gun in separate pockets of his coat. He stood and worried for a moment over why Banks would want him dead. The only explanation he could think of was that he was getting close to whatever it was he was hiding that connected him to the body. When he was satisfied that he wasn't going to stir, he left him in a heap behind the car and walked to the Firestone to retrieve his things. He picked up his hat from where it had fallen off his head and replaced it with a satisfied smile. He had felt rather naked without it. He packed up the field enhancer quickly and silently, wanting to be out of the cold dark and back to his room at the Green Man. He realised he would have to drag Banks back to the police station before he could go back to his hotel room, and he began to wonder if he should disturb Drew and ask for his assistance. Within 10 minutes, all the rods and wires were packed away with the battery in the case. As he had pulled the rods from the ground, he noticed they were all burnt out, singed around the wires and where they had broken the surface. Closer inspection also revealed that the battery had shorted out. When he was satisfied that everything was safely packed away, he hid the box that contained it all behind a tree at the side of the road, as he would not be able to lift the case and Banks at the same time. He then prepared himself for the hauling of the sergeant's dead weight. However, when he arrived back where he had left Banks's unconscious body, he was surprised to find he had gone. He glanced about the scene, looking around and up and down the road to try and see any sign of him, but he had fled. The inspector thought for a moment, feeling as if he was missing something about where Banks would be heading. He suddenly noticed a thin trail of blood on the floor from where he had left Banks laying, and he followed the trail to the edge of the thick copse. In desperation or out of fear, the inspector knew not, but Banks had run into the copse. He peered into the dark woods, but the inspector knew from experience that if Banks was between the trees in the dark, then finding him would be impossible. He retrieved his equipment and walked doggedly back to his hotel. He let himself in and snuck back to his room, glad to finally be back to the here and now. He looked out of his window, out into the bleak night at the swaying trees of the wood in the dim light. He wondered where Banks was, what he was doing out there, and where he was going. Tomorrow he would start a manhunt, but now he had to rest. End of Part 2.